Coming up next, The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy. Every Thursday from 4 p.m, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
People are struggling to have conversations and connect with others that they don't completely agree with on every topic. And I think that's probably the biggest problem that we need to try and solve, is how after all this division and after all this separation do we end up bringing people together again, and what does unity really look like?
New Zealand faces some pretty big issues. First one is COVID and the aftermath. There's no getting away from that. Second is racial division. It's been ginned up and it's dangerous. Another issue that maybe people haven't got their head around yet is digital currency. What form does that take? Is it programmable? Will it be used to manipulate behaviour and patterns of behaviour? Those questions need to be asked and answered.
How can you have fair, open, democratic government by people who are appointed? It's a ridiculous idea. And if that idea is taken to its zenith, then this country is in real trouble, because democracy, one person, one vote, where every vote is of equal value, has got to be the foundation of a modern New Zealand.
What's true, what's not true, how our kids are to be educated. And, I have a great fear for the future. I think we know from history where this could end up.
This is The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy, right here on RCR.
Welcome to The Crunch on Reality Check Radio. I'm your host, Cam Slater, and this is the place we crunch the political issues and cut through all the politicians' spin. Today we're going to dig into the farce that is developing around tikanga and the Waitangi Tribunal. First up, I'll have Sandra Goudie back on the show to talk about an article that Dr. Michael Bassett has written about the Waitangi Tribunal's attempt to expand their remit and their power. And then I'll talk to the author himself, Michael Bassett, about the same article and a bit of a catch-up on some recent revelations from Kaingora. Naturally, we'll hear from Cam's buddies and see what they have to say about those recent revelations of the financial morass that was left by the Labour government in Kaingaora. Of course, we'll have the whale bag to get your feedback too. And don't forget to send comments to inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057. Today, we need to confront the appalling economic sabotage orchestrated by the last government, which has left our public housing sector, known as Kaingaora, in complete disarray. Recent revelations from a series of damning reports paint a grim picture of Kaingaora, our public housing agency. It's also New Zealand's worst landlord. A review has uncovered that Kaingaora is underperforming to such an extent that it is not, and I quote, financially viable. Yes, you heard that right. The agency responsible for providing homes to our most vulnerable citizens is on the brink of financial collapse. The root of this crisis lies in the mismanagement and neglect by the previous administration. They failed to implement proper oversight and allowed inefficiencies to fester. The result? A public housing system that is crumbling under its own weight. The government has now put all public housing programs under review as they scramble to clean up the mess left behind. A new chair has been appointed to Kaingaora in a desperate attempt to steer the ship back on course. But why did it take a crisis of this magnitude for action to be taken? The previous government had ample opportunity to address these issues, but instead they turned a blind eye. The impact of this negligence is far-reaching. Families who rely on public housing are left in limbo, uncertain about their future. The financial stability of Kaingaora means that critical housing projects may be delayed or cancelled altogether. And this is not just a failure of governance, it is a betrayal of our citizens who deserve better. We must demand accountability from those who allowed this situation to deteriorate. It is not enough to appoint new leaders and hope for the best. We need a thorough investigation into how this crisis was allowed to develop and who is responsible. And we can start that investigation with the former Finance Minister, Grant Robertson, and the two ministers who held the housing portfolio, Phil Twyford and Megan Woods. And of course, there's the Labour Party lackey who chaired Kāinga Ora under their guidance, Mark Goudie. The public deserves answers, but more importantly, the public deserves solutions. And as we move forward, let us remember the lessons of this debacle. Effective governance requires vigilance, transparency, and a commitment to the public good. The last government's failure to uphold these principles has cost us dearly, and we have the opportunity to rebuild and create a public housing system that truly serves its purpose. Stay tuned to Reality Check Radio as we continue to bring you the latest updates and in-depth analysis on this and other pressing issues. Let's hold our leaders accountable and strive for a better future together. Sandra Goudie's back on the show, and she's not one to hide how she feels about any topic. This week, we're going to talk about the plotting going on inside the Waitangi Tribunal, who are seeking to expand their powers. Sandra's on the line and joins me now. Welcome back to The Crunch, Sandra. It was great having you last time, and it's going to be fantastic having you this time.
Awesome. Thank you, Cam.
Now, you're a bit exercised about the shenanigans going on in the Waitangi Tribunal, and in particular, an article that Michael Bassett wrote entitled Maori Push for Parallel Government Structures. This is not well known, is it?
Not really. What got me exercised way back at the beginning was, for some reason, I picked up the Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975 and read it. And I was absolutely gobsmacked by what was in that legislation. And historical claims, treaty claims, are entered into in 2015. It's signed by Isaacs, and then there's another memorandum from the tribunal signed by Fox. And it actually says they're going to start a raft of inquiries, constitutional inquiries, and that was back in 2015. So most people aren't aware of that, and they all relate to government department activities because the Treaty of Waitangi Act allows the tribunal to make inquiries and make claims against any action of the government.
Forever.
Well, unless the legislation, the Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975, is changed and the conditions around the Waitangi Tribunal are changed, yes, it goes on ad infinitum.
So let's get this straight. This constitutional review that the Waitangi Tribunal has undertaken began in 2015. That's when John Key was the Prime Minister, and then handed over to Bill English. I wonder if they're aware of these extrajudicial reviews that the Waitangi Tribunal is trying to do, constitutional reviews of how we're governed.
Well, I don't know that they would, because these are put out in memorandums by the Waitangi Tribunal, and I'm not sure what the level of oversight of the Waitangi Tribunal is by government as it goes about scrutinising its business and the level of scrutiny it gives. So I don't know whether they delve into the memorandums that come out. And this memorandum referred to in my memorandum of 1st of April 2015, I indicated I would comprise 11 inquiries and set out the order in which they would commence. Included in that program was an inquiry into claims concerning the Constitution, self-government and the electoral system. So that all happened. That was all referred to in a memorandum of 2015. That's how long ago it was. The level of understanding outside of the Waitangi Tribunal, I don't know.
I think the level of understanding in the general public about the Waitangi Tribunal is scant, and it would appear that the Court of Appeal has an equally scant opinion about what the Waitangi Tribunal is supposed to be, and have, unilaterally almost elevated them to the status of being a court, which they're not.
No, because their only authority is to look into claims, and they can only make recommendations to the government. They have no power to do anything else other than to make recommendations. Now, I'm only speaking as a layperson, but one of the other provisions within the Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975, which does give some cause for alarm, is that within the realms of the tribunal, they can interpret the principles of the treaty how they so wish.
And that's leading to these judgments, if we can call them that, from the Waitangi Tribunal that start talking about things that don't exist, like a partnership, an equal partnership in the treaty, rather than what the treaty actually says, which is ceding sovereignty to the Crown.
But again, they only have the ability to make recommendations to the government. They can't make judgments and statements. It's recommendations only to the government, as far as my understanding goes. They develop PO, which are project operational units. They call them PO, P-O-U. And they do the groundwork for what they propose to put forward to the government. But again, these seems like papers of fait accompli rather than recommendations to the government which they can either accept or refute.
It seems like they're creating a make-work scheme for themselves. And one of the flows of work in this make-work scheme seems to be drafting a new constitution, or indeed a constitution, because New Zealand doesn't actually have a constitution.
Well, the problem with it is that someone, one of the governments, changed the Act to allow them to do that, because the historical claims were coming to a close. So they had no work in front of them. They had to create a reason for continuing to exist. And so therefore, the amendment to the Act gave that opportunity to them. And so the government has made a huge error in how they amended the Act to enable the plethora of claims that can now be made. They can make a claim on the fact that their kaupapa was not included in nurses' training, things like that. I mean, it's completely open to whatever they want to make a claim against in terms of their kaupapa. And then, of course, it's only for Māori. It's denied to everybody else. And I just think that people forget that we're all a part of this treaty, and it's in line with the Queen Victoria's Royal Charter, which preceded the treaty and is really the basis on which the treaty sits.
But who made this amendment? Which government made that amendment?
Well, this particular amendment I haven't explored more closely. All I know is that there's about 12 amendments have been made to the Act over time, and predominantly all by Labor, bar one from National. The actual wording in regard to the contemporary claims, they're called, the kaupapa inquiry, I'd have to explore that and find out for sure who actually made that amendment. But what's done is done. The key thing is we have this piece of legislation now. It's going to be challenging to see if the current coalition government can rise to that challenge, and it will be a challenge to amend the legislation so that it becomes sensible. I think one of the ways to actually curb it is to allow the same playing field for the rest of New Zealanders. I mean, I'd like to take a claim to the Waitangi Tribunal on the basis of prejudicial bias in favour of a minority against the majority.
Theoretically, you could, because the Waitangi Tribunal is set up to explore grievances under the treaty. And there's new grievances that are being now created by these rapacious settlements that are going on, and then enacting of legislation which creates further grievances where we've got a race-based system happening in, for example, health or something like that.
That's right.
So
I can't take a claim to the Waitangi Tribunal because only a Māori are allowed to.
Well, that's something that needs to be either amend it or remove it completely.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So that's where the challenge for government comes, for this current coalition government. So
I don't think Christopher Luxon's got the stones to do anything with that, but I'm pretty sure that Shane Jones and Winston Peters do.
I have no doubt, and ACT as well. And so it's just I don't know that the National Party has been challenged on it yet enough to see where they would go on this, because I think they have to do something. It's getting somewhat out of hand. I mean, yesterday I went to a hearing with the regional council, and they're wanting to put up the rates on properties over 20 hectares. So that's penalising those particular properties unduly, and that's for having lots of areas of bush and things like that partially. And yet under the remissions, Māori can claim for those same areas of bush for remissions in their rates.
Well, that doesn't seem...
But no one else can.
Yeah, so it's not a level playing field, is it?
Well, totally not. And everybody else is paying for it. It's this constant tithe, and it's hidden.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean, Michael Bassett's onto something here. You know, and there's no person smarter in New Zealand politics than Michael Bassett. He's suggesting that there is in fact a move afoot by the radical Maori fringe of New Zealand society to create a parallel system of government, parallel to our elections, where iwi have power over everybody else.
Yep. But it's already being driven in legislation, like the whakahono-rohi agreements within the RMA. The types of preference that Māori have within legislation, those things are already being driven so that there's an obligation there. I mean, one of the things that Sir Michael Bassett referred to was Professor Sir Hugh Kawaru from Ngāti Whātua. And, you know, huge respect for Sir Hugh. And I was on the Hauraki Golf Forum and delighted when Moana Tamariki was elected chair in her own right, no co-chair, as head of that forum. Sadly, though, she didn't have, as I understood it, the full support of the appointed iwi, and made life very difficult. So I was sorry to see her have to step down.
Are we perhaps seeing this fuss that was made over summonsing Karen Shaw, the children's minister, to the Waitangi Tribunal as a tactic to have the government reject that, which they did? They won in the High Court that said, no, you're not a court. You can't do that. You only have limited powers to summon people. Then that allowed the Waitangi Tribunal to appeal that. And then you get the activist judges who say, well, actually, yes, you can be summoned to the Waitangi Tribunal, but whoopsie, we're a bit late on this one because the legislation's already been put before the House. But it's just a tactic to get the Court of Appeal to say that, yes, they can be, so that now the Waitangi Tribunal can dream up any summons they like and drag in government ministers to harangue them, essentially by the majority of the 20 representatives on the Waitangi Tribunal are part of that radical Maori fringe that magically believe that sovereignty was never ceded.
Well, I think it raises a couple of interesting points. First, it sounds like the High Court is smarter than the Appeal Court, and certainly it sounds like they've actually read the legislation. Secondly, I think it's starting to be recognised that the Waitangi Tribunal's become radicalised. And thirdly, the ability for them to summon someone in regard to legislation, whether the legislation has been drafted or not. I don't think that the Treaty of Waitangi Act gives them the power to do that. So certainly they can summon people to the tribunal for other matters, I would have thought, but not for legislation. And so that's where I think the High Court got it right and the Appeal Court got it wrong. But as I say, I'm only a layperson who's had a good reading of the legislation, so what would I know? So, but, you know, I just think it's crazy. I think that I was delighted that the legislation was introduced into the House, which cuckolded the Waitangi Tribunal attack. But I think that sends a signal to the government that they have to act. They have to change the Treaty of Waitangi Act, the 1975 legislation. They have to do that.
And I think Michael Bassett's onto something here when he says that there is a move to get rid of the word quasi-judicial and to give the Waitangi Tribunal the full powers of a court, despite the fact there is very few members of the tribunal that have any legal skills at all. Only one, the judge, I understand, who's in charge, Karen Fox, has any sort of legal skills in the Waitangi Tribunal. The rest are a bunch of radical Maori fringe dwellers that have got this heroic view that the treaty is something that says is something that it does not.
But this is the type of thing that Labor has done consistently, particularly over their last term of government. And one of the most glaring examples, but only glaring to people like myself who are a bit who get sort of dig into some areas, the public have no idea. But the legislative guidelines, and they have a legislative committee, which is appointed by the government, and there's not enough scrutiny of that. And they change the legislative guidelines to such a degree that I think, again, that's another area that the government has to look at and give some serious scrutiny to, because the law must be clear and it must be equitable. And I think we need to have another look at how the rule of law is constructed. It's the construction of the law that's as important as what you start to put into it. Because if the legislative guidelines aren't robust and you're being led down the garden path within them, then your law is not going to be robust either. And that's absolutely critical.
I think the Labor Party, you have to admire them really for their rat cunning, their low rat cunning, because I've been saying for years that the problem with the National Party is that they're the party of the status quo, that they very rarely do any sort of reforms or repeal anything. They just like to manage what they've inherited from the previous Labor government and then do nothing. And so Labor, by doing these legislative changes and allowing these heroic assumptions about what the treaty says and its interpretation, have allowed that to become the urban legend to become reality, because most people think that that's what this is because of the language that's used by the politicians, et cetera, that this is a partnership. And they knew that the National Party would do nothing about it. And that's what we're seeing, that the National Party is sitting there like stunned mullets watching what's going on. And it seems to be only ACT and New Zealand First, but in particular Winston Peters and Shane Jones and David Seymour, who have spoken out against the Waitangi Tribunal. Notably, all three are Maori. Probably not the right kind of Maori that the Waitangi Tribunal would believe, but they're Maori nonetheless, have spoken out about this. And so we may actually see some action if ACT and New Zealand First squeeze the nuts of Christopher Luxon.
Well, Christopher Luxon, but the responsibility actually all falls within the purview of the Attorney General. So, as I understand it, so I think there has to be
Judith Collins.
Yes, and I think there has to be some concerted effort. If this last action by the Waitangi Tribunal, which pulled in the appeal court, doesn't give national pause that they have to take some action, they have to be prepared to buy that fight and be prepared for the hickoys and the like, because I don't see that we're going to see anything else but a concerted campaign to bully the government into submission by the vociferous actions of a minority.
I mean, we're seeing these Maori radicals in the universities, on the Waitangi Tribunal, also in Parliament in the Maori Party, who absolutely, despite all the evidence that's gone before us from Ngāta, from Sir Hugh Kaurau, they refuse to concede that Maori ceded sovereignty to the Crown. And the Maori Party comes in and says, no, we didn't. They absolutely are adamant that Maori never ceded sovereignty to the Crown, despite the fact that the translation says the chiefs of the Confederation give absolutely to the Queen of England forever the complete government over their land.
Oh, well, does that make their treaty claims null and void then?
Well, that's the issue, isn't it?
Oh,
if you've
okay, so
got
we
someone
might as well,
who changes the
cancel their
definition,
treaty claims.
yeah,
Because
ask
if
for it
they-
all back.
Yeah, like if they can start all over again with the musket if they want. But actually, no, I take that back. That's getting a little bit crazy. But it does beg the question, well, if you didn't, then why did you enter into a treaty claim process?
I mean, basically what they've done, and again, you have to admire the cunning of it, right?
Well, no, it's sort of dumb cunning, because here they're on the one hand saying they never ceded sovereignty, and yet they signed into a treaty claim.
Yes, but the woke white people will all sit there and go, oh, yes, poor hard done by Maori. I better shut up about this because I'll be called racist, even though we're debating facts that are written down facts nonetheless. But they've contrived this confusion around what Article 1 of the treaty really says and means. And
let's not forget Article 3.
Yeah, and then use that confusion to claim that sovereignty still rests with Maori. So they're now pushing that parallel system of government, which if you look at everywhere else in the world where a parallel system of government has ever been implemented, it ends in tears at best or violence at worst.
But it comes back to what I said to you before. The Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975 gives them the ability to interpret the treaty principles in any way they like, because it's meant to be constrained by the fact that they can only give recommendations to government. But they've taken it a step further. They are actually pushing these things as absolutes, not recommendations. And so that's the concern that you raised earlier. And so that's what they've got to do something about in terms of the legislation. They have to change the legislation. I'm not interested if they want to claim they didn't cede sovereignty and all that garbage, because they're saying that on the one hand and taking it on the other. I mean, come on. It's just a joke.
Well, the thing is Article 2 and 3 guarantee Maori equality with everyone else in New Zealand.
That's right. And so now every time I see a prejudicial bias in favour of a minority, which is becoming much more consistent from the government in terms of its legislation, I now call that a breach of the treaty, because I'm a part of that treaty in Article 3, that we're all meant to be equal under the law. So whenever the government identifies or creates a prejudicial bias in favour of a minority, it's a breach of the treaty in regard to the rest of New Zealand citizens.
But you can't do anything about that breach.
No, I can't, because I'm not Maori and I can't take a claim to the Waitangi Tribunal. Besides, with the radicalised Maori there right now, would I want to?
Well, hang on a second. There might be a little escape clause for us all. We can use the transgender debate and say that we feel Maori and therefore we are Maori. And we might not be affiliated with a traditional iwi, but our iwi is Ngāti Pākehā. So now we're going to take a claim to the tribunal because we feel Maori and are Maori, just the same way that a bloke can put a frock on and say that he's a woman.
Well, it has been said that you could potentially do that because some legislation sort of makes it a bit ambiguous. But it's a bit like the word tikanga and the word matauranga. So they talk about tikanga Māori. Well, actually, you can talk about tikanga Pākehā. You can talk about matauranga Māori and matauranga Pākehā. Matauranga is essentially just knowledge. Tikanga is just your behaviours, essentially.
But every iwi and every hapu and every grouping of people has different tikanga. So,
that's right.
You've got the law schools now saying there will now be compulsory tikanga courses. Well, whose kitanga are we going to?
But they usually say tikanga Māori, and that's why they want tikanga Māori and tikanga matauranga Māori written into legislation, every piece of legislation. And so, and having councils have to adhere to tikanga Māori and matauranga Māori within some of their obligations. It's crazy because...
it's totally crazy. I mean, I can only see one possible solution, which I'm not sure that Christopher Luxon has got the stones to grasp the nettle on, but the only possible solution to this is abolish the Waitangi Tribunal. It was set up in 1975 when there were very few Maori in Parliament. It was intended to safeguard their interests, guarantee their voice, and deal with treaty claims. There's only one claim outstanding now. That's Ngāpuhi. And they should just abolish the Waitangi Tribunal. We know, established what's happening in Ngāpuhi, create special legislation just for Ngāpuhi, get that settled. That's it. See you later.
Sounds like a plan.
Thanks for coming. Here's your final check. And see you later. Oh, by the way, we've already leased the building and the offices to somebody else. you could move out at the end of the month.
Well, you've got the Maori Land Court, you've got Te Puna Kōkiri, you've now got the other one that escapes me from Awhita. I've forgotten the other one that was created under Labor in 2021, a whole new government department simply to advise the Attorney General. And the work that they're doing is alarming, to say the least, and it needs a lot more scrutiny. But it's another bigger story to some degree. On a whole different topic, but certainly related to these issues, I was wondering in the debate around media funding, where the funding for Māori media was coming into it. And I never saw a breakdown of any of the figures of all the media that's funded by the government.
Oh, there's numerous ones, but in terms of Maori media, you've got the Radio Wātea, that's funded by the government. That's Willie Jackson's little private vehicle. John Tamahiri's involved with that as well. You've got Maori Television, which I'm not sure anybody watches it, but we fund that to the tune of millions of dollars a year. And no one's hearing anything about Maori Television losing any revenue and going down the gurgler. So they must be sitting there like Radio New Zealand in a state-funded bliss and laughing like hell.
That's the thing that I found missing, was basically a spreadsheet of all the media funding provided by the government. And so a spreadsheet so everybody could see exactly how much the government was contributing where, and have a much more informed decision and discussion around continued media funding and what level that might be, in spite of the TVNZ and TV3 scenario. I think there need to be a much more holistic, encompassing discussion around it myself.
We're starting to see some information come out, particularly around advertising revenues. Philip Crump, or otherwise known as Thomas Cranmer on X, formerly Twitter, he's produced some documents on how much some of the COVID advertising that was spent by one agency, just one agency, tens of millions of dollars. Most of that went into radio and television ads and, of course, social media. But I've said this to government ministers before. I said, you need to get the heads of department and tell them to come to a meeting with the minister, the state services minister or whoever it is. Come to a meeting armed with all of the facts about your media spend for the last 6 years and your projected media spend for the next 6 years. I want all of those facts and figures. Present all of those, and we'll see just how many tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars across all government departments has been spent on inane advertising. A classic example is the ad that's on the radio for people to look again at intersections so they can see motorcyclists. Look again, just nags you on the radio. The endless advertisements for COVID's still lurking out there, better get another jab. The endless advertisements for the flu jab, for the measles jab, for everything. There's just endless advertising from government departments. And then say, well, as of right now, there's a moratorium on any spending for any government advertising, any government department. And there's a committee that we've set up here. And if there's something that's urgent, like we've got an outbreak of something we need to advertise for, then just take it to the committee and they'll approve it. But in the meantime, there's no spending for 6 months while we get a handle on this, and then give it to someone like Bill English, who loves spreadsheets, and cut the hell out of it, and then see what happens in the media, and see what happens in the media environment when they no longer have the government teat to suck off.
Think about the savings that the government would make on that alone. And I just wonder how much they're aware of that's actually been allocated to those areas within each of the ministries. And in line with that, one thing I'd love to see is that if adjectives are taken out of any media release so that it becomes more factual data, and that any statement made by the media, there has to be a reference available to some empirical data to prove that it's true.
That'd be another good one. I mean, have you ever been to the doctor's surgery and sat there waiting? Because you always wait. They're never on time, right? You're sitting there in the doctor's surgery and the walls are covered with literally hectares of printed material about breast scanning or mumps or measles or rubella or anything. There's just posters everywhere. You just sit there thinking, you dare not look at it because it just depresses you on all of these illnesses. But that's what the health department, the Ministry of Health does. They send all of these out to all these medical practices and they stick them all up all over the place. There's pamphlets, there's who picks up a pamphlet? I've never seen anyone
it may
pick
come
up a
from
pamphlet.
Maybe come from the pharmaceutical company that's promoting the product to save you from these things.
Yeah, could be. But you get my point. I've never seen anybody go, yeah, you go to lab tests or whatever they call it. You go, oh, look at that. It's like when you go and stay in a motel, right? If people still do that these days, stay in a motel and at the check-in place, there's all of these racks of all these brochures of things you can do, and almost no one ever takes them. And so that's the same in the lab tests and doctors' rooms. There's all of these brochures, and you never see Mrs. Miggins get up on her walker and trottle over there and sort of rest and reach up and grab a little brochure and go, oh, yes, I must get my smear test. They don't do it. So why are we producing all of this stuff?
Cam, I wouldn't want to exercise myself on that. But the one thing I would love to see you do is find a way to actually exhort the government in writing to do that spreadsheet of the advertising and media spend.
It'd be interesting to do it via an OAA, but I suspect they'd reply, oh, no, it's commercially sensitive. We can't give you an answer. In which case, a question to the minister would be the way to do it. That
means you've got to write to how many ministers?
Well, no, you just get an MP to ask the question. Backbench MP who's doing nothing.
What, to ask the question in the House?
Well, not necessarily in the House, a written question.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Right, because then you'll get an answer, because they have to answer you in a written question from one MP to the minister. They have to answer.
You've answered my question, so it looks like New Zealand First a good avenue for that, a good vehicle for that.
Yeah, New Zealand First or an ACT MP. They've got a few more spare, that aren't doing too much. Get them the task of finding out what the advertising spend is for every government department. It would be eye-watering sums.
But I don't want just the advertising spend. I want the media spend as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You want the whole lot.
No, thank you for that. I'll do that.
All right.
I'm a doer. I like to do shit.
There we go. You organise that.
I will.
And then when you get all the answers, we'll have another interview discussing that.
I think it's a bit passé now, isn't it?
Oh, I don't know. I think walloping. This is the thing, right, with government ministers, and I have to educate a lot of people about what goes on in Parliament. I know a couple of people that had been down to present a petition, and they then went and watched Parliament, and they said they couldn't believe looking down from the gallery above, watching MPs playing Candy Crush, reading websites, all while Parliament's in progress. And I said, well, you've got to understand something here. It's all for show. It's not reality what you actually see. And anyone who goes down to Parliament as an MP thinking they're going to change the world just gets ground underfoot by the system. The system never changes because we don't do what they do in America. When the government changes, when we get a new president in the United States, all of the heads of departments, almost all of the cushy ambassadors' jobs, they're instantaneously wiped out, gone, see you later, and new ones are appointed. And we don't do that. And so you get a new government in, and you'll get a press secretary who is working for James Shaw is now working for the same job for the new minister in a new government. And it's ludicrous that they actually keep these people on. But that's the system. And so if you go down there wide-eyed, bushy-tailed, you're going to change the world as an MP, the system doesn't let you.
It can do. I look, in the main, but I don't agree entirely. I actually think there are opportunities, and I think people do make a difference. But it does remind me of Michael Cullen and the Fiscal Responsibility Act. I felt that with Labor's such shocking handling of our money, New Zealand's money, that we should have been taking them to court under the Fiscal Responsibility Act.
But that's,
Anyway.
again, a classic example of the system working for the benefit of those in the system. So, Ruth Richardson passed that law, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, because of the
That's
absolute appalling state that the books were in 1990. And National stupidly goes along with it and plays by the rules. Labor never does. They don't care. You had Michael Cullen, then you had Grant Robertson, the Minister of Printing Money, and he's buggered off and got a job that pays more than the Prime Minister on the basis that he used to be the Finance Minister who spent money like a drunken sailor.
That's right.
And there is no responsibility. There's no penalties under the Fiscal Responsibility Act. There's no willingness of anybody to enter into a prosecution. No new government is going to prosecute the old government because they'll be worried that it'll be tit for tat when they get bundled out of office. And then you end up with a situation like you've got in the United States where Democrats are keeping Donald Trump in court on spurious grounds simply because he's Donald Trump. And they run the risk now that when Trump wins the next election, that he turns around and does the same to them.
Well, someone said that he's in jail, he wins the election, becomes the president, he immediately pardons himself.
Oh,
I thought that was quite funny. But look, you're right about the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And so therefore they should try and find some mechanism which potentially can cuckold a change of government to such a degree that they are forced to behave more responsibly. But anyway, those are bigger debates.
Well, what you need is penalties to say that if you breach the Fiscal Responsibility Act, then you are removed from being an MP forever. And that way there is some consequences, some real-world consequences for being a moron with the country's books. I mean, we look at Milei in Argentina. He passed a law in his first 100 days that says if anyone in the Reserve Bank wants to print money, they go to jail.
So therefore, along with that, I like that idea about preventing them from being member of parliament ad infinitum, but also maybe an independent commission of some sort which has oversight of their books and their fiscal decisions. But anyway, I think you're probably just about done with me, have you?
Yeah, I think we are up against time. Sandra, as usual, we've had an absolute ball solving the ills of the world, and you're welcome anytime back on the show. So thanks very much for coming.
Thank you. Take care, Cam.
All right, thank you. The Waitangi Tribunal seems to be pushing the barrow of a few rowdy ratbag activists who are trying to shoehorn our democracy into a co-governance envelope, effectively conducting a constitutional coup. It's great that we have people like Sandra Goudie who highlight issues like this. Tell me your thoughts on what Sandra had to say by emailing inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057.
Our text machine is now live. Send us your thoughts by texting your message to 2057. That's 2057. So get in touch with us now. You're listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
Dr. Michael Bassett is a political historian with a depth of knowledge like no other. We talked earlier with Sandra Goudie about his article, so let's get his views on the Waitangi Tribunal, tikanga, and the goings-on at Kaingaora. Michael joins me now. Welcome back to The Crunch, Dr. Michael Bassett. Good to have you back.
Pleasure.
We're going to touch on quite a few things, but before we get going, you would have seen the news about Kaingaora and the billions of dollars in the red that they are. And I'm thinking, back to the dark days of Muldoon and thinking that this previous Labor government over 6 years have really performed a level of economic sabotage that is on a scale, obviously in today's dollars, with what Robert Muldoon did. The sole exception, of course, being Robert Muldoon actually built something.
Well, Robert Muldoon was his own Minister of Finance,
Yeah.
and he kept a slightly better sort of eye on the budget than Grant Robertson. I mean, the $80 billion that was borrowed and then flung around the place recklessly, extraordinary, really. And where now everybody's grizzling and up in arms at the thought that somehow or other we might try to live within our means. If they ran their domestic budget the way they want the government to run the country's budget, we'd be in a fine shape.
I find it astonishing that the Labour Party come out and, Christopher Hipkins made a speech on the weekend, and it's like nothing happened nothing did happen in the last 6 years, but it's like he's expecting us to forget the excesses of that government. As you say, the money that was flung about with gay abandon and caused huge amounts of inflation. And they're sitting there thinking that they were these wonderful stewards of the economy. But the facts are now leaking out all over the place. Kāinga Ora is just the latest one, where it's apparent that there was a systemic problem in the cabinet, in that ministers weren't on top of their portfolios and keeping a track on what was going on in these government departments.
Well, my own feeling is that about half of the cabinet of Jacinda's and Hipkins weren't really on top of their portfolios. And I mean, the last year saw the most extraordinary collection of crises, from Michael Wood to Kerry Allen, and there were others as well who just sort of fell over and weren't really properly in control.
Yeah, if you look at Kāinga Ora and housing, the two ministers that were in charge of that for pretty much half each of the 6 years were Phil Twyford and Megan Woods, both of whom were the campaign chairs for various elections for the Labour Party. And yet this massive portfolio of which they hung their hat on for their election campaign with Kiwi Build and then extending state housing is an unmitigated disaster.
Well, you said it. I wouldn't in any way disagree.
Have you seen anything since we last chatted? And I'm going to ask you each time we chat, have you seen anything to change your mind that this was the worst government in living history?
No, I said as much when they were in office, and I still think that certainly the worst government since the war, the Second World War, weakest government too, in the sense that Labour usually, certainly it did in the 70s and the 80s, have some reasonably talented people, but things went dreadful. Even under Helen Clark in the beginning of this century, there were some pretty competent people in that in her government, but that competence level just sort of faded completely. And they did no work between 2008 and 2017. I mean, I found that business of setting up 240 committees to work over what they should do now that they were in office just bizarre.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that they did do is make some changes that has enabled a few Maori radicals to start to what from where I'm looking at it from looks like essentially like a bloodless constitutional coup is underway in our justice system and in our universities and in society in general, all hanging around this fanciful idea that there was a partnership between the head of the British Empire at the time and a disparate group of warring Maori iwi.
Yes, well, that's certainly what it looks like. But the real question is whether this government, since the last government didn't, has this government got the intestinal fortitude to knock it on the head?
I'm not sure that Christopher Luxon does have the stones to do that, but I'm pretty sure that Winston Peters and David Seymour and Shane Jones have got the willingness to do it. It's whether or not they're allowed to do it.
Yes, quite. Well, that's going to be the real test. And it'd be a great pity if the government came to the end of its time and hadn't really made it perfectly clear that the government, the elected government, was in power and had the sole right to make decisions, and that there was no such thing as co-government because Maori had ceded sovereignty in 1840. That's what it's really about.
Yeah, it's this heroic assumption that sovereignty was never ceded that seems to have grabbed the attention of media mainly and a few Maori radicals, and a lot of them are coalescing inside the Maori Party. They've got this idea that there was this co-governance arrangement. And by staying silent, people who oppose that are letting it happen.
Well, certainly that's what it looks like. Quite where and how their version of the treaty, where it's to be found and what precisely it says, I'm unaware. All I do know is that the only translations of the treaty that I've seen, of the Maori version, make it absolutely clear that sovereignty was ceded forever in 1840, and therefore there is no argument for co-governance. And what Maori have got to do is argue, and I think they can legitimately, that anything that has to do with them, they should be consulted, or the appropriate Maori should be consulted.
The right kind of Maori.
Well, that's a different from saying that a handful of self-appointed Maori leaders should be able to wield 17% of the power on behalf of people who have never elected them in any way, shape or form to speak for them.
I was talking to Sandra Goudie earlier, and she was talking about an article that you wrote on your website, Bassett, Brash and Hyde, about a Maori push for parallel government structures. And I was in the middle of talking to her about it, and I thought, I actually should just get you on and talk. It's good to get somebody else's perspective of what you wrote, but it's good to find out the thinking, because without blowing smoke up you, you're one of the biggest thinkers in New Zealand politics that I've ever met or known. And I read your article about this Maori push for parallel government structures, and most of it being done through the Waitangi Tribunal and their, I hesitate to call it judicial activism, because they're not a body, it's part of the judiciary, but they think they are. And that's the thrust of your article, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Karen Fox, is it Karen Fox? Is that her name? Yes. Karen Fox seems extraordinarily self-important, and, the feeling that somehow or other we're on some kind of mission. I think it possibly goes with the MoCo, and she certainly has got a head of steam on. But the last government, rather the last national government, was actually contemplating 10 years ago getting rid of the Waitangi Tribunal because the historical claims were over. And there were only a handful of claims which could be advanced, day-to-day claims. But somehow or other, they've just simply decided they're a court, and that they'll be whatever they're, the people that come to see them, they'll simply decide in their favour. I don't think under Karen Fox or under any of her predecessors going back into the 1990s, I don't think the Waitangi Tribunal has ever turned down a case.
Yeah, they take the case, they mark their own homework, and then deliver what they call as a judgment that have, far-reaching implications. And perhaps the most significant one in recent memory is the foreshore and seabed issue that was made as a claim to the Waitangi Tribunal, and then they came out and said, yes, that's what we're going to do, and then that caused a massive problem for Helen Clark.
It went to the High Court. That was Sean Elias who made that decision, I think, in 2003, and caused the problem that led on to the foreshore and seabed legislation. But the legislation that Clark's government pushed through was thoroughly sensible, but unfortunately it was undone 6 years later, and so we're living with a situation now where slowly but surely quite large parts of the coastline in New Zealand seem to be being given permanently to Maori.
There was a John Key government that undid all that as part of their, bribe, I guess, to the Maori Party to garner their support, and it leads a lot of people to question whether or not National will sell out to Maori interests at the drop of a hat when it suits them.
Well, I have the same suspicion.
I'm not at all confident that Christopher Luxon wouldn't do the same thing.
Well, the interesting thing that I touched on in that article that you were referring to, he seemed to be unaware of what the status of the Waitangi Tribunal really was. And when he got, he censured a couple of his ministers for criticising the judiciary. He didn't, when they criticised the Waitangi Tribunal, he didn't seem to know that the Waitangi Tribunal was not part of the judiciary.
Well, what's stupid about that from Luxon's point of view is he was reacting to a farcical presumption by Thomas Coughlan that this was the judiciary and that they'd breached the cabinet manual, which is a joke. It's just not possible.
Well, that's right. Thomas Coughlan, of course, is a pretty good journalist, far better than most of his colleagues. But be that as it may, he did get that one wrong.
Yeah, and then that led to Luxon trying to tell off David Seymour and Winston Peters, who both probably laughed at him quietly in the background. But you mentioned in this article that it appears to be an attempt. It's like there's a slow moving strategy. The first tactic would seem to be to try and get themselves declared as a court, and so they need to create an issue for them to then be able to progress that. And that issue was, let's see if we can get a minister summoned to the tribunal to answer questions or be harangued or whatever they planned to do over government policy that a government was elected to enact. And they were trying to insert themselves into the political debate. Then that, of course, went to the High Court, and then we've got this judgment that's saying, well, yes, the High Court agreed and said, no, you can't summons a minister. And then it went to the Court of Appeal, and then we got this outrageous decision that basically achieved what the Waitangi Tribunal was trying to achieve, which was to get themselves lifted above quasi-judicial to actually being part of the judiciary.
Well, we have a very serious problem developing with our judiciary, the upper echelons of it. I'm not quite sure whether it was sloppy appointments by both National and Labour. I suspect it was both parties that have been responsible for putting people who were not fit and proper onto the court. But we're dealing with people who, it seems to me, have divorced themselves from common sense.
Well, it certainly appears that way. I mean, if you just look at the legislation that created the Waitangi Tribunal, there's no way it's a court. And yet we're seeing increasingly judges that are writing law from the bench. And that always ends in disaster.
Yes, and they're very, very prone to accept any Maori sob story. Now, I've spent much of my life arguing that Maori deserve a fair shake of the dice, but I went to a function not that long ago where the Chief Justice was to speak, and she spoke for about 20 minutes in Maori. And there was nobody there no Maori present as far as I could see. And quite why it was necessary, I do not know. It was discourteous, if nothing else.
Well, you're seeing this at all levels of the court system, because if you go and I've spent a fair bit of time in court, unfortunately, but 10 years ago, you would attend court, the registrar would come through the door and say, ask everybody to stand. While his honour came in, he would stand up the front, nod to all the people there, sit down, and then the various lawyers would stand up and introduce themselves, and then they might say, "I'm Smith for the defence," or Jones for the prosecution, and then the judge would acknowledge them and just make a note, and then sit down and say, "Right, well, let's get going and start the process." It took about 5 minutes to do that. Now, however, particularly if there's any Crown solicitors involved or barristers representing aspects of the Crown or a Crown entity of some sort, you get these pepehas now where the judge comes in, there's about a 20-second or 30-second ramble in Maori, God knows what it says. The judge comes in, nods to everybody, sits down, and then they proceed to stand up and recite who all their ancestors were for 5 or 10 minutes each.
Is this in court?
In court, yeah. I couldn't believe it when I saw it. It's changed just in 10 years.
Bizarre.
So, actually it's probably just changed since we had a Labour government. But the government departments are the ones that are pushing all of this. And it is making justice confusing, because not everybody speaks Maori and not everybody is going to.
No.
Ever.
Right.
And yet they're pushing this on everybody and sort of sniggering to themselves that you can't understand it, and perhaps you should educate yourself, and that's the arrogance of it all.
Yes, so it's exceedingly arrogant stuff. And that is one of the reasons why I think the opposition to Maori and Maori programs and Maori claims is so hostile and will get more hostile. It is the extraordinary arrogance of a lot of it.
And again, I think this comes back to the previous government, led by Labour and Labour in its entirety for the last 3 years, who promulgated this fanciful idea there was this co-governance. National stupidly, John Key stupidly signed the UNDRIP, which basically agreed to that sort of Indigenous rights. And I spoke to John Key about that, and I said, "Why did you sign UNDRIP?" He says, "Oh, well, because there's no Indigenous people in New Zealand." And I said, "You fool, there are now." Right? Yeah. And that's what Winston said, that caused great consternation in the chattering classes when he said there's no Indigenous people from New Zealand. Everyone, their own whakapapa says that they came from somewhere else in canoes. And yet we've now got this idea that they've got Indigenous peoples, and then that goes into the co-governance arrangements of the Treaty of Waitangi, which were never in there. And as you point out in the article, a proper translation, a realistic translation, it said the chiefs of the Confederation give absolutely to the Queen of England forever the complete government over their land.
Quite.
Full stop. That's it. There's no equivocating. There's no weasel words in there. There's no get out of jail clauses. There's none of that.
And the funny thing is, while that interpretation, which was done by Sir Hugh Carfrew, replaced the original text and even the text of the treaty in English, and I've got it here in front of me, says that the Confederation of the United Tribes of New Zealand cede to Her Majesty the Queen of England absolutely and without reservation all the rights and powers of sovereignty. So there was no great surprise in Hugh Carfrew's translation, where my point is that this doubt that you will find in various places about whether Maori ceded sovereignty is never backed up by any actual new translation of the treaty. They don't dare do that. They like to keep a degree of confusion because it suits Maori to reinterpret the treaty. It suits them to reinterpret all sorts of things. Tikanga is made up on the hoof. So it's one of the reasons why Maori is so opposed to David Seymour's idea of the treaty principles, because he would have something that was fixed and made clear in law. They want a fluid situation where they can reinterpret whenever they like, and the rest of us can fall into line. And it's all being done by a relative handful of people who are claiming that they're acting on behalf of oppressed Maori. Most of the so-called oppressed Maori wouldn't know who these guys were, or guy-esses, it's all bullswool.
And you're right, they never say where they've got this idea from. If you then point to a translation or the English version, then they say, oh, no, that's not what it means. It means something different now.
Yes, that's right. Well, they want confusion because they know that New Zealanders don't want to be labelled racist, and they don't want to be called out. But the reality is that most New Zealanders have reached the point where they've had a guts full of this stuff. And I suspect that if it really came to a vote, Maori would have great difficulty getting very far. The immigration coming into the country is incredibly sour about the preponderance of effort that's being put into Maori. You've only got to look at the Auckland results in the election last year to see that. The Indians joined the Chinese, who joined many of the other ethnic groups, who just saying you can't give a preponderance of say on matters of government to people, a small number of people, on the grounds of some kind of bogus, and it is increasingly bogus ethnicity. I mean, you're looking at people who are 1/8, 1/16, 1/32 Maori, and claiming that drop gives them a jump ahead of the new citizens, the white citizens, everybody else.
Well, you're seeing people, in the media, like Phil Gifford, for example, who should just stick to commenting on sport because he knows a little bit about that. Not a great deal, but enough to get by and make a crust doing that, who proclaim that they've now discovered their Maoriness that was hidden from them in the past, and they're now what I like to call neo-Maoris. They've discovered this little minute piece of DNA, and somehow that minute piece of DNA is so powerful that they're entirely Maori now. And a case in point would be Willie Jackson, who has a very tiny percentage of Maori ancestry DNA, and actually, and in fact, has more Jewish DNA than he does have Maori DNA, but yet he's the right sort of Maori and is, in effect, probably one of the most vocal racists that there are in New Zealand politics today.
Yes. Well, I'm inclined to agree.
But again, we come back to the treaty, and I mean, you've noted that there's this, and I have to laid the blame of this at the feet of the media, where it's now probably impossible to eradicate this phony debate about what the treaty says and what it was intended to do. And as I said, I blame the media for that because they have not been critical. They've not said, hang on a second, but what about this? Or at any stage of it, they have embraced what Bob Jones calls Maori wonderfulness and have now turned their news organisations into organisations that produce news stories that are filled with almost pidgin English now. Words being inserted for calling New Zealand different name and all sorts of other things that go into it.
One of the interesting things was that the new government said that it wanted organisations to be called by their English names. Sure, they could have their Maori name tagged on, but Radio New Zealand has slipped, TV1 has slipped, TV3 has slipped. They're all going back. The Herald, of course, never got off the Maorification bandwagon. And you're looking at a situation where they're thumbing their nose, all of them, at the government.
Well, you've got the situation where the previous government, again, I blame them for this, went about changing everything. We used to have the Ministry of Health, and then that was split into two, and both of the organisations were given Maori names. You know, we had Te Whātau Ora and something else, and all of a sudden it was like this assumption that if you give something a Maori name, it'll be better. and we've seen from Kāinga Ora that that's not the case. You know, it's like them launching the supposedly fast rail solution between Hamilton and Auckland and calling it, naming it after a dead bird, thinking that that was going to make it fly. And it hasn't. It's highly subsidised, where you've got a situation where 97% of the costs of that rail service are met by the state in various guises, either the local council or actually the state, and only 3% of the expenses of this massive boondoggle, so they could say they had train services between Hamilton and Auckland, only 3% is met by the paying customers, of which there are a scant few.
Right.
But they gave it a Maori name, so it'll be better, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, Maori names, there's something in the Herald this morning, an article where a sentence begins with a couple of Maori words, and there's nothing to indicate what on earth they refer to, what it is that's being said. We've lost our way somehow, and it's insulting, really, to Maori to have inflicted upon them this silliness, which patronising Pākehā are inflicting on them.
I think it's mainly from the left-type parties, Labour Party, Green Party, Maori Party. There's this patronising idea that Maori are helpless, that they can't do things for themselves, and therefore the state needs to step in and mollycoddle them at every level of society for everything they do, a separate health system, a separate education system, separate, everything separate, and that will give better outcomes. And there's no evidence for that will ever work. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the apartheidization of New Zealand society won't work, right?
Yes, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Well, yes. Co-governance and separate development, if you know anything about the rest of the world where those sorts of policies have been tried, you know to avoid them. And the notion that somehow or other Māori can have all of their things and bogus tikanga and bogus this and that, that we can all get on sweetly together while the rest of us kowtow to them, forget it. this country is capable of descending into ethnic warfare if there isn't an improvement.
Well, this tikanga thing is all driven by the same premise, isn't it?
Yep.
That our time-honoured judicial system, court system, legal system will be improved by adding tikanga but into the system. And
nobody can define what they really mean by tikanga.
But who's tikanga? Is it Ngāpui's tikanga, or is it is every iwi has its own tikanga?
Tūwharetoas or wherever.
Who's tikanga? And who says that this is going to make it better? It's not law.
That's the key question. People overlook the fact that, there were only at the time of the treaty 100,000 Maori in New Zealand, in a country that now has well over 5 million. And, they were scattered around in little groups, little linkage between them, except when a raiding party, a warlike party, set off to subject or subjugate them or to eat them. And there was a fair amount of that during the Musket Wars. The thought that each individual tribe had its own customs didn't seem to occur to people today who talk as though somehow or other there was some pan-Maori tikanga, which there never was and never will be.
Well, it just can't.
You can't. You can't get them to agree. Government starting with, I think it was Holyoakes in the 60s, tried to get a group that would speak for Maori as a whole. That was the origin of the Maori Council, and it never really worked. And in the end, you don't hear anything from the Maori Council today. I don't know whether it even exists anymore. But you do hear occasionally from the Iwi Leaders Federation, is it? Or the Iwi Chiefs Federation? I can't recall.
Something like that. Some
precise name. But even it it's incapable of actually binding all the iwi that it claims are gathered under it. And so the consequence is that there is no standard thing called tikanga and no standard customs or practices or anything really.
And if you look, you mentioned the Musket Wars. In 1821, Hongi Hika raided extensively against his rivals. This is just 19 years before the treaty was signed. He raided extensively in the Auckland and Coromandel region and captured in excess of 2,000 slaves and marched them back to Ngāpui lands. And 19 years later, he died in 1828, but in 1840 we're signing a treaty with the Crown, and the Crown in the UK at that time had abolished slavery, but the treaty allowed the various chiefs to keep all of their possessions, which included slaves. And we have to have this heroic assumption that Maori were this erudite, enlightened, wonderful group of people that were stunning navigators, but somehow couldn't boil water or make any implements with metal, were on an equal footing with a woman who would go on to be the Empress of India and the head of the British Empire. It's a fantasy, but we're supposed to not say anything about it, to nod sagely and agree that there was this partnership or co-governance unwritten in the treaty, but that was the intention of Captain Hobson and the British. I'm struggling with this.
Well, I think if you've got any questions, by all means, fling them, and we'll call it a day.
That's the thing. Is there a way out of this? Is there a solution to this activism from the Waitangi Tribunal and the imposition of tikanga and this belief that there was a co-governance arrangement, unwritten, unsaid, but it's there nonetheless? Is there a way out of this?
Well, governments have to be quite frank with this tiny number of people, and they are small. It is a small number who keep arguing this way all the time. Your great mass of Maori workers and truck drivers and nurses and so on don't believe any of this bull's wool, or at least don't care about it. But governments have to be firm and make it crystal clear that sovereignty was ceded in 1840, that all the governments since then have been legitimate governments, that Maori are entitled to their own political parties if they want them. But remember that you've got to abide by the rules that have been set by all.
Yeah, nearly 200 years of jurisprudence and lawmaking by legitimate parliaments that have represented in everybody's interests.
Quite. But until such time as governments are quite firm on those things, make it clear to Maori that they can advance their arguments in preferably a pan-Maori body that should be elected by all Maori to speak for Maori to government, instead of just having a few self-appointed experts, mokoed ladies from the University of Waikato or the Waitangi Tribunal or wherever.
Margaret Mutu, who I see has changed her name now to something else.
Yes, well, I mean, she's a disaster, poor soul. But
the media go to her every single time, though, don't they?
Well, you can count on her to say something that will give them a cheap and easy headline.
Yeah,
and away it continues to go. But there may be some people around who agree with Margaret Mutu. I confess I've never come across any.
And you've been around a long time to meet a lot of people. So.
Oh, yes. She came along to the Waitangi Tribunal, I remember, on one occasion and sat in the back grumbling and saying that it was a disgrace that I could even ask certain key questions that were relevant to the case. You've got a real strange one there.
But she's the go-to person to the media. So that's where we come back to, isn't it? Isn't the problem that we've got in New Zealand society is a lack of responsible journalism and a lack of responsible editors and a lack of journalistic credulity about what all of these people that are pushing these agendas, no one's holding them to account, and they seem to be actually cheerleading and bandwagoning rather than actually doing their job.
That is true, but you have to go a step further. There is a real problem with the universities in this country now. They are in serious decline, and history and politics and so on. There are very, very few really good, reliable academics left to straighten out the journalists, to educate them in the first place. And sad to say, this country at present is going through quite a decline. I find it quite distressing, really. But the best brains are departing, and some of the worst are in the media.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you and I can solve the problems of the world, but maybe we should. But you're right. The politicians need to grasp the nettle. They need to not be afraid of upsetting a few rowdy people and start to make decisions around these sorts of things. As you pointed out, there's very few claims. In fact, I think there's only one major claim outstanding, which is Ngāpuhi. The day of the Waitangi Tribunal is over. really.
Oh, long gone. It's all, I mean, Margaret Mutu, we were talking about, she's at the centre of quite a lot of the trouble up there. I mean, it's a problem solving it, Ngāpuhi being a big, variegated area with a lot of people living and working outside of the area and putting their oar in from time to time and making it very difficult for the government to actually find a satisfactory solution. And every day that goes by while these people have their way and stop a solution is a day when Ngāpuhi fails to get the settlement resources, which they eventually will.
Yeah, I can remember a news article that showed Andrew Little, the treaty negotiations minister at the time, with a very angry look on his face. It just, he had the nickname Angry Andrew for a reason, or Angry Andy for a reason. He was an angry man, but he was at a meeting to try and progress the Ngāpuhi claim, and he got so frustrated he was banging the table, and somebody took a photo of it. And I actually felt sorry for Andrew Little at that point. And it's not often I have too much compassion for politicians. They enter the fray willingly. But in this instance, I actually felt sorry for him, that here he was trying to actually progress something and was met with intransigence that you could not believe unless you were part of it. And I actually felt sorry for him.
Chris Finlayson had the same problem before that. I mean, he tried hard to get a settlement.
And he'd be the softest treaty negotiation person ever, Chris Finlayson. He's a lock for Maori interests, Chris Finlayson, that's for sure. And if he got frustrated by it, then it just shows you just how badly managed or badly controlled Ngāpuhi and the various hapu that are part of Ngāpuhi are letting the entire iwi down.
But Ngāpuhi is a sort of a microcosm of the wider problem of Maori in New Zealand. Nobody agrees with anybody else. They're all, singing their own songs and got their own version of tikanga. And Maori are a very difficult people when it comes to dealing with them politically. I mean, I'll bet you've got lots of Maori friends. I have.
Yeah.
You get on with them, and they're wonderful.
Yeah.
But how have they got such jerks representing them?
Well, I mean, we talked about the Waitangi Tribunal trying to elevate themselves to a judiciary, and you've mentioned that it would be good to have a pan-Maori organisation that could represent Maori, perhaps be elected. But we've seen a similar tactic, haven't we, in Tainui, trying to extend the Kingitanga movement to be a pan-Maori movement, which of course will never work because Ngāpuhi not going to listen to someone from Tainui. Neither is Tūwharetoa, neither is Ngāti Kahungunu or anybody else. The Kingitanga movement is isolated to two areas of New Zealand, and the rest of Maoridom looks at them and goes, "What are you trying to be a white person?" A quasi-king movement that was dreamed up because they thought it was a good idea. If England could have a queen, then we can have a king too. And people forget that.
Yes. I think we've about
yes, I think so.
Exhausted our issues, but we'll talk again sometime.
Well, thank you very much for coming on again, Michael, and it's been a real pleasure. I always enjoy talking to Michael Bassett about politics. He's forgotten more than I remember about politics. And he's also such a gentleman, but he does have strong opinions on the excesses of a few Maori radicals who seem to have hijacked the Waitangi Tribunal. Let me know your thoughts by emailing inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057.
Check out our brand new RCR Foundation Members Club. Go to realitycheck.radio/members and join now.
Now it's time for Cam's Buddies. This week we'll find out what they think about the debacle unfolding inside Kāinga They're New Zealand's worst landlord, and it looks like they're New Zealand's worst financial managers as well. My producer has them all lined up and ready to go. Let's go now to Cam's Buddies. Welcome to Cam's Buddies, Jimmy. Good to have you back.
G'day, Cameron. You good this week?
Always good, mate. I'm not. I'm always good.
Good.
Because no one cares.
And what subject do you want this week, mate?
Look, there's been a bit of a fuss in the media about the parlous financial state of Kāinga and it's billions of dollars in debt, not financially stable going forward. And I want to know what you think about that.
Well, it's just another big monumental Labor failure, right? Chuck money at things, think money equals will solve your problems, and realise it just doesn't. You can't just chuck billions of...
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it's a problem per se with Kāinga or the staff or at a certain level of the staff, but I think certainly at the governance level, at the board, and certainly the ministers that were in charge. I mean, would you have a guess at who the ministers were who were in charge of that?
Megan Woods.
She was one of them. Exactly. You got it 100%. You're up with the play on politics. So those two numpties were the architects of this demise and helpfully handled or enabled by Grant Robertson with no fiscal controls over what was going on. And it seems to me that there's a systemic problem amongst Labor politicians that they have no idea how to govern things.
No, well, Phil Twyford was such a failure that even Jacinda, who was always scared to demote people, he was one of the only ones that she demoted. He was such a failure. It was this Kiwi build. It was like a disaster, an embarrassment. And here he is in charge of Kāinga for a bit. Crazy. And
totally
look
crazy.
At the results. Billions of dollars wasted. There's just more failings. I mean, you got to feel sorry for Luxon. He's trying to mop up so many problems at the same time. Massive. Where do you start when everything's failing at the same time?
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's billions of dollars here. And, these clowns are sitting there lecturing us all about how they were fiscally safe and sound in dealing with the stuff. And they just weren't.
No, I know. And I mean, you have to be fiscally prudent with your household expenses, business expenses, and governments need to be as well, because the money just won't last forever. And I mean, do these people treat their own bank accounts like this? Just ginormous, lending, and it's just I don't understand it personally. I really, honestly don't. Is there any Labor MPs that have successfully run quite a big business?
No, and I see on Tuesday Barbara Edmonds, the Labor finance spokesperson, who's basically been a tax lawyer and then worked in Treasury, is coming out and saying that the budget that Nicola Willis is going to deliver, and you have to argue that Barbara Edmonds is possibly a slightly more qualified than the BA carrying Nicola Willis, but has come out saying that this budget is going to be full of smoke and mirrors. And I thought to myself, that's more cheek than a fat lady's bum to say that when you've had, there's three words that I could say to them about that when they talk about smoke and mirrors, and that's well-being budget, which was all smoke and mirrors, It
was complete and utter failure. And don't measure the results. That was the well-being budget.
That's right.
Throw billions at stuff and don't measure.
Well, they spent $1.9 billion on mental health and not one single outcome has improved. This is just symptomatic. Yeah, it's symptomatic of how Labor views things. What they do is they think that the metric for success is how much money you've spent.
No, it's astounding how much money they wasted. And we could have had some nice stuff. We could have had some new highways and bridges and new hospitals. Instead,
well, that's the thing. They could have built
nothing to go.
They could have built a surgical hospital or in Auckland. That just all the surgery in Auckland goes to that hospital, and then that would free up space in all the other hospitals that are all around the place, other than just sort of emergency surgery and things like that. There's a number of things they could have. I mean, they could have built the bloody hospital in Dunedin, which is still not even out of the ground.
But the problem we have is that until we get a decent media that questions both governments or any government, like they're attacking Luxon now, if they'd attack Jacinda the same, or the previous Labor government, because it's just so hard to make with the average punter's interest in politics only sort of, sound bites in the news. It's impossible to push the other, the fiscal responsibility. You just literally can't borrow forever. Even the United States is, going to run out of money.
Oh, they'll just print some more.
A little country like New Zealand just can't do that.
No. We have to live within our means. If you keep going into overdraft constantly, the bank eventually says no.
Yeah. And governments can get big overdraft on the back of taxpayers, but it still can only get to a certain level before you're, collapsing under your own weight. And New Zealand's at that point, and Mr. Luxon has got to be part of the team that's got to do the ugly part and start cutting and gets attacked for it. But I don't know what they propose as the other solution, just continue on into complete financial ruin. So, yeah, this is just another thing, another failing, and there'll be more and more, and it's going to take a long time to recover. So, yeah, that's my take on that.
All right. Anyway. Anything else that's ripping your undies at the moment?
Actually, I've had a really busy week, so I haven't actually been watching the news. But no, nothing massive that I've noticed. No. I've actually been productive at work, Cam.
Well, you need to be productive to pay lots of tax so that all the people who are bludging can continue to bludge. And the nation thanks you.
Okay, thanks, mate.
Okay, thanks for calling. Catch you next week. Welcome to Cam's Buddies, Lindley. Good to have you back.
Hi, Cam. Are you feeling fantastic today?
I always feel fantastic, Lindley. You know why I always
good.
feel?
I'm pleased to hear it.
You know why I always feel fantastic?
Because you convince yourself to.
Well, yes, there's that, but nobody cares if you're not. They just ask you out of courtesy, but they don't actually care if you say, "Oh no, actually, my shoulder's killing me. I've got a sore neck. I've got a crooked knee." They've stopped caring about 5 seconds before, after you open your mouth. So I just say, yeah, everything's fantastic, and it always is.
Well, you see, I've got this lad in Mitre 10, and for the third time today, or third time I've struck him, and I struck him today, and I say to him, "Oh, hi, how are you?" And he says, "I'm not too bad," which is a fairly traditional thing for Kiwis to say. And I say to him every time, "Well, now that I know what you aren't, what actually are you?"
He'll probably be flummoxed.
He's absolutely flummoxed, and he's still flummoxed. He hasn't worked it out yet.
Oh, well.
But that's typical. That's typical of what people say. But anyway,
yeah. So I'm fantastic,
from the topic.
I'm fantastic, and I'm picking your fantastic.
I am.
So,
but I really am.
No, good. I really am too, because if you have a mindset that you're fantastic, then you'll be fantastic.
I think so.
Yeah, power of positive thinking. I think somebody wrote a book about that.
Oh, yes, they did. Made a fortune.
Yeah, and he was fantastic after that.
Mm.
So anyway, Kāinga Ora. We've seen the revelations have come out this week that they're woke and broke, that the board has not really been governing the organisation, and the two ministers that were in charge of it, Phil Twyford and Megan Woods, have just let this, it used to be called the Ministry of Housing. It's called Kāinga Ora now. Apparently giving something a Maori name makes it better, apart from being New Zealand's worst landlord, have managed to beggar the nation while they've been building not much.
Well, I think it's an absolute travesty, and it's in common with what's happening right through every government department, right through all the local councils, down to the smallest committees. They're all broke. They all run amok with the money, and it's an absolute disgrace. And we've just had put our submissions in for the long-term plan for our councils. It's absolutely broke too. But anyway,
no
I just want to say to these, no accountability at all. But I just want to say, I own my own home, and I got it the hard way.
Yep.
And I have to run a budget to keep it. It's not beneath my dignity to grow my own veggies, to scrounge the forest floors with cones and kindling, to run the roads.
They make the best fires, though. Those cones, man, they make the best fires.
It's crackling away at the moment. It does the hot water. It does the heating. I can cook on it. You see, I'm thrifty. And I don't mind running the roads instead of a gym subscription. And I do most of my house maintenance myself, Cam, and that's called budgeting.
Yeah.
Now, why is it called Kaienga? It's Kainga.
Yeah, I don't know. Don't know what it means.
Well, anyway, Kaienga ora is above such things, isn't it? It's become addicted to handouts. That's really the problem.
You know, it saddens me because this is an organisation that is supposed to look after the most needy in New Zealand, right? They are New Zealand's biggest landlord, and the people that they have residing in their homes are the people that theoretically in most need, and yet they have blown billions and billions of dollars on debt, on fanciful plans, and gold-plated homes that are probably going to just get trashed, and all the while kept on going back to Grant Robertson, the finance minister, and asking for more money.
And they've got it, you see. That's the problem. I mean, who am I going to ask for a handout, you know? I'm not going to get a handout. So, you know, that's out of my mind because that avenue's not there. But they've got that avenue, and, you know, at the end of the day, we're just animals, and they've learned that's where they go for their pot of gold. So they keep going back there. They never learn to think in a different way, be visionary or something, cut the cloth to fit the garment and all that sort of stuff.
Do you think
they
that
just don't do it?
Yeah, do you think there's a systemic problem with particularly Labour politicians, that they have a lack of understanding about how money is earned and therefore how they spend it? And as a result, they also have no ability or experience in actually running anything or building anything. And that's why you see organisations like Kainga, that they fill the board positions with their flunkies. You know, the chairperson was former Labour Minister Mark Goshi, a union man. He was the chair of the board. He resigned earlier in the year. The entire board was filled with woke wombles, who really didn't know anything about the organisation that they were governing. Is this a systemic problem that we're going to see revealed periodically over the next few months of one organisation after another that has had poor governance from not only the board but also the ministers that were responsible for it?
Well, it couldn't be more systemic, and that's absolutely my point. And, you know, this is the crux of all government entities down to local councils and, as I said, the smallest of bureaucrat committees. They all believe in buy now, pay later.
Yeah.
And then when it catches up on them, they borrow more and more and then more. And I've got a suggestion for them, which sounds to me like you'll agree with. I suggest that they phone their own government service, which is the New Zealand Government Money Talks, I'll even give them the phone number, 0800 345 123, or the Citizens Advice Bureau, and they sign up for their own free and confidential budget advice and learn how to run a budget, because paying compounding interest doesn't work. It gets you in the SHIT. Now, I think you'll agree with that.
I do agree with it. I think that at the very least, the people who are on the board of Kaingaora should be given remedial budgeting lessons, at the very least, because if they were running a private company and were doing what they were doing, they'd be prosecuted, because what they've done is actually criminal. It
is. It's absolutely outlandish. I mean, have you sort of looked into some of the local council debts? Oh, I know. It's eye-watering. It's absolutely eye-watering. And they don't care. And you see, they're the same. They have got a tap that they can turn on for funding, and it's called a captive clientele. That's ratepayers. Well, this Kaingaora, it's got a tap to turn on, and it's called government funding. But they don't have to do anything. They don't have to. I mean, what happens? Who actually sits there, and does anybody add up expenses, income and expenses and all those simple things? Well, you would have thought the ministers would do that, or at the very least Grant Robertson. But who pays the penalty apart from the taxpayer? We pay the penalty of their poor governance. But who actually pays a penalty for stuffing something up so royally? I mean, there surely must be consequences for I don't think there are, and I'll tell you what, Cam, I do actually think it's all governments. I'm happy to just blame Labor and the Greens and that, but I think... No, they're all the same. I agree with you. Systemic, systemic is the word you said. I wrote down a sentence here because I had to do this for a fortnight ago for another reason, for somebody else, and I want to read this out to you. This is typical. This is Sir Bill English's... he led a review, of this dire situation. Yep. And this is typical of one of the outcomes of that review. It's a 45-word sentence. We found that Kaingaora is not financially viable under current settings, and this is further compounded by limited attention to value for money and opaque apportionment of costs and revenue within Kaingaora, making it difficult to identify the underlying drivers of financial results. That's 45 words. And my 6-word sentence is, they're broke and they don't know why. Would you agree with that? Yeah. No, I think Bill English knows why they're broke. But, yes, the organisation is broke and they don't know why, and they think that they can just carry on. They do. And they've got an operating deficit of 520 million. Heading maybe for 700 million if something's not done. I hear that they've got 30,500 on the waiting list for housing. Yeah, they're morons. And it needs $21 billion with a B over the next 4 years just to cover the losses. And then Kieran McAnulty, he said that all this could have been avoided if the government had committed to ongoing funding. Well, I'll tell you what, I could have avoided a lot of hardship in my housing quest if I received ongoing funding. Oh, that's right, but I never received. That just shows how out of touch they are, that Kieran McAnulty, the putative leader of the opposition, the guy who's waiting for Chris Hipkins to fail so he can step into his boots, is saying that. It shows how out of touch they are. But then again, he also said he was proud to be a socialist. And we all know that socialists have a very poor grasp on economics. It's never worked anywhere in the world. And every time you point this out to them, they say, oh, well, that's because that country did it wrong. And if we just do it our way, then it'll work better. Is that what they say? Oh, yeah. But when you say to them,
if socialism was so grand, how come Venezuela, that's got more oil than any other country in the world, how come Venezuela's broke? They go, oh, well, that's because they did socialism wrong. That's what they say to you.
Yes, but when they do socialism, they're not down amongst the mob, they're still up on the hill living a grand life.
But that's the thing with socialists, right, is they never, ever have to take the lumps of coal like everybody else. They're always with their snouts in the trough, and that's why it doesn't work.
That's right. No, it's a fantasy.
Yeah, more misery has been visited on the people of Earth by communism and socialism than any other governmental system, ever.
I couldn't agree more, and I don't know if you've read Orwell's 1984, but I could only get halfway through it because it was so horrifying. I had to give it up halfway, and then I went online and read a review of it so I could know how it ended. But
Jacinda Ardern used it as a playbook rather than a war. Orwell wrote 1984 and 1948, and he wrote it as a warning. But Jacinda Ardern obviously picked a copy up from the library and thought, oh, this is awesome, I'll do this. This is exactly what we need to do.
Yeah, and did it and learned how to turn the people against themselves. Then they don't have to go out. They don't need a police force or anything because they've taught people to dob their neighbours in and all that sort of thing. Absolutely horrifying. I hope they never get in again. It was the most terrible experience.
Just imagine what she was like at school. She would have been the class snitch.
Oh, well, I don't know what she'd have been like. I can't imagine. I'll tell you what, when you had that chap on, did an interview with him absolutely ages ago, and he said she was such a lovely person, I just about choked.
That was Simon Lusk.
I can't remember who it was, but it was a long time ago.
It was Simon Lusk. He's the only person I know who says that Jacinda's lovely.
Yes. Well, he sort of wasn't on the far end of her like a lot of us were. But no. But also they've got other problems with this housing as well, and how it's got into such a dire state. They've got massive increased immigration, really, for a wee country. And again, it's the buy now, pay later theory, because they get the people in first and then worry about the infrastructure afterwards, They do put the cart before the horse, don't they?
I'm pretty certain if Labor had got back in, Grant Robertson would have commissioned some genetic modification of some particular plants so that we could have a native money tree growing in short order, but he would spend $100 billion trying to make that happen.
Yes, well, and he'd borrow it.
Mm.
But then the other thing is that occurred to me when I was thinking about it, and that's the solo parent situation. And I know that there are some solo parents that really have to get rid of their spouse one way or the other because they're violent or whatever. But there's so many solo parents now, and that creates two houses out of one very often because you've got mum and the kids in one house, and then where does the bloke go? He needs a house as well, doesn't he?
Well, yeah. Or he usually picks up some other poor, unsuspecting woman and moves in with her and continues on his drinking, gambling, bashing ways, and then there's another house involved.
That's right. It was so much more stable years ago when they had the state houses and that because, they went basically to hard-working, low-income families, so you had ma, pa and the kids all in the one house.
Yeah.
So they only needed one house for the family, but when the family splits up, then you need more than one house very often.
Yep.
So that is an issue too. And then the other thing is once they've built all these promised houses and they put people in them, they've then got to pay, or often have to pay, rental subsidies for the tenants. So that's an added cost, and it's absolutely huge.
Well, I don't know if you and I are going to ever solve the problems of this nation where people expect the government to solve absolutely every problem that they come to mind. You know, we see it all the time. Labor's out there saying, well, what we need is the government to feed the kids at school. And so then they come up with this program. It's not funded properly. We're spending millions upon millions of dollars feeding kids at school. And whilst I sort of agree with the sentiment that, well, if we don't feed them, then they'll get nothing, I just struggle to believe that the vast majority of parents in this country don't care enough about their kids to send them to school with lunch. And, they can do with budgeting advice and, stop smoking cigarettes and stop buying fatty foods and stop spending money on lotto or the dogs or the races or the booze or whatever. They're making poor choices. But it seems that the safety net that we have in New Zealand that was originally envisaged as a safety net has actually become a trampoline and in some cases a hammock for people.
Yeah, well, it will always do that. I mean, the intentions were good at the beginning, but, even like it's beneath people's dignity to send their kids off to school now with, let's say, cheese and Marmite sandwiches, that's just, and all the experts are out there saying, oh, they can't do that, it's absolutely dreadful,
Well, my mother used to put butter on the bread and then sprinkle Milo on it and send me to school with Milo sandwiches.
And you're still here today.
Well, they were delicious. Once that butter soaks all the way through that Milo, the crunchiness is all gone and it's all this buttery chocolate goodness on white bread.
Oh, well, that's absolutely dreadful, isn't it, But, I mean, even the nutrition experts are out there saying this is absolutely dreadful. But, when I went to school, we just had lunch. We didn't have a three-course meal.
Well, I challenge those public health people that are whining about this, who go on about saying we need to have nutritious meals. They have you ever seen these people? They don't look happy at all.
No.
They look miserable, right? They look like lemon-sucking, miserable, I won't say the next word. And, I challenge them, if they think these meals that the schools are providing are nutritious for the kids and are of paramount importance, I challenge them from Monday to Friday for a month that they eat the same lunch and see if they still say the same thing.
Well, I haven't seen what they have for lunches, but it looked pretty extravagant to me, actually, but I don't know what they had.
Well,
but it's,
if the government's
it's just
providing it, it won't be that good.
I think, I think, to sum up what I think about this thing is the absolute root cause is this attitude of buy now, pay later, and it's right through the whole government system.
Totally.
And it should not be allowed because once it gets to millions of dollars in interest, they can never get out of it again. And, I don't know.
Terrible.
That's the first thing I think has to be dealt with, and then look at all these other social issues and that to do with the housing. But you just can't keep going without knowing how to run a budget. They should never get into this situation.
No, they shouldn't. Thanks for your thoughts, Lindley. I've got to go to the next call, so I appreciate your time, and we'll talk next week.
Thanks, Cam.
Take
care.
Okay,
bye-bye.
Welcome to Cam's Buddies, Paul. Good to have you back.
Hi, Cam. How are you?
Fantastic. What about yourself?
That's good. I'm very good as well.
Now, did you see the news in the last few days about Kāinga Ora? Basically, Bill English has conducted an inquiry. He's looked into the books of Kāinga Ora, found that it is financially unsustainable moving forward. Has record levels of debt and is basically broke. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I did hear about that, and I thought of all the people that could do it, Bill English is very talented at such work, but he will be poorly recognised because they'll say he's a white male and he's got a problem, whereas he's actually very good financially. And
I agree with you.
When I look at Kāinga Ora, what they've got is they've got a limited income, which is governed by their clientele spends, I think, something like 25% of their income on rent, so that they have 75% of income to do other things, so that they're not in the real world having normal market rules. And then I believe that they also go down the path of not being proud homeowners in many cases, so that you can often recognise Kaingaora places because the owner of the house is the government, and the tenant is thinking that they've got a whole lot of rights going in their direction. Now, my thoughts are that we need a percentage of government housing, and we need a percentage of helping people get into their first home. And I thought, well, if you got all the government, like when my parents and my wife's parents were young, we were considered not middle class, but middle to poor.
Yeah.
And they got given the ability to capitalise their child allowance.
The family benefit.
And the total of the capitalisation of the family benefit or the child allowance was enabling them to have a deposit to buy a house.
Yeah.
And many of them bought a house, and in so doing, that was their first house, and that a lot of families got a house that way. And because we've had, we don't want any septic tank type thing, so you have to get to the main stormwater system, and in so doing, it costs a fortune to put in the drains, the stormwater, the sewage, and those sorts of things. So now, although if you fly over Auckland and just flying to Hamilton, there's so much bare land that's available that would be good for housing, but then we've got so much red tape around it. Like, if you gave me 50 acres of land and $5 million, I could probably get you 50 to 100 houses with roads on them connected up to a septic tank system. And whereas if you use the current regulations and things that are being used at the moment, to do the same thing would cost you 50 million, not 5 million. And so I'm looking and I'm thinking, what we've got here is we've bureaucratized, I guess, our way out of having affordable housing. And then we've got the poor people, and we're saying, well, countries like the UK, they might have 17% of the housing as government-owned or council flats and the like. And we've got a government previous to the one we've got in now that said, oh, we will stop landlords from wanting to be landlords by taking away their tax exemption on their interest and make everything hard for them. And we'll add more and more rules and call it healthy homes and say, it's got to be good for you. But the only person it's good for is the people that sell such things. And then there's more and more difficulty or competition for tenants. And who are our tenants? They're the poor. And then you've got the poorest of the poor that they don't even get a shot at normal tenancy because they don't look right. If they've got patties on their face, or they come around in a bomb and there's a half a dozen of them, no landlord worth his salt says, yes, you're the people for me. They look for the best of the 50 people that apply. Yeah. And then, so that puts you back into the government having to supply, or the council having to supply such things. And they've got 62,000 properties, and they've got 200,000 people living in them. Then they've got a load of people who are thugs in them, and so that they have, I think they moved 150 of them for antisocial behaviour. But all it starts way back. It starts at no dads in the house. So if you have a couple and you say to them, you go and finish school till 7th form, don't have a baby before you're 22, and get married to one person and then look at what you're going to do, those people will end up owning their own home and becoming perfect citizens.
Yeah.
But if you say, oh, here's these people with no fathers, so the girls can go out and breed like flies, and so that the girls have 2 or 3 kids before they're 20, then someone's going to be funding the bill for that, and they're going to be breeding generations of the same. And so if you've got absent fathers, uneducated people, and if you've got the state prepared to be the dad and supply the house and supply you with income, so you've got multiple generations of people who have never had a job and multiple generations of people who rely on the state for everything, then you get a problem like we have. And then if you look at it from someone taking a sensible financial look at it, the thing's broke, and it's and it's full of, I really don't want them in my backyard. Like I live in Aoraki, and they're putting in I think 120 houses just behind the Aoraki school in a high rise. Not many people think it's a good idea.
No.
Not many people think that it's going to add to the quality of the kids that go to the Aoraki school. But there we've got people building in a relatively expensive area a lot of very cheap housing, and the people that often move into those places have got other social problems that they bring with them.
Yeah.
Now, it's all very well to say at the same place we've got all the Bastion Point houses that are they have got a whole lot of state houses on Bastion Point on the way up there that I think are still owned by Koingora. Each one of those houses is sitting on a $2 million site, and you could block them together and get 10 of them together and get 20 million, and with that 20 million, you could build 100 houses somewhere if you were to do it, perhaps in not such an expensive suburb. So
doesn't that point to
all these things add up?
Yeah, doesn't that point to a lack of proper governance by the board of Kaingaora, and then also by the ministers, who seem to not have the foggiest idea about what the business or the activity of this government department is, which is to provide cost-effective housing for the least among us. That's a classic point where you've got a house sitting on a piece of land that's worth $2 million. The house is probably worth $500,000, but if you wanted to buy the whole thing, it would probably cost you $5 million. And you've got one family in that. Whereas if you deployed all of that capital in a more cost-effective manner in an area that's more conducive to this sort of behaviour, you might have 150 houses as a result. And so that just shows that I mean, for goodness sake, they had on the board the chairman of the board was Mark Goudie, who's a former union boss and Labour minister, and they had a guy from the Salvation Army on the board. Now, what remotely qualifies either of them to be on the board of New Zealand's largest landlord?
Well, exactly. And also, what they always say, and you hear them say it often, and time again, I even heard it, old Skippy saying it in Parliament, what about the children? This government wants to take food out of the children's mouths and give it to greedy, rich landlords. And what they've got is, like, it's an easy line to beat the government with the poor children. Where did the poor children come from? Did the poor children just, like, when there was no social welfare and the family had to look after the child, so if a woman had a daughter out of wedlock and the family had to look after the child, then the family would say, we can't afford too many of these, and so the children would all learn that having lots of children at home without fathers or without families wasn't a good idea. When the government said, we'll give you money for each of those, you can actually now retire on the income of 4 children, and not do anything. Plus, we'll supply you a house and all this kind of malarkey. Then suddenly, what we've got is lots of these things occurring, so that the more houses like that you get, the more that you need. And is it reasonable, like if someone has a child and them and their partner split up, and then there becomes a problem, and so that the mum goes on child welfare, that's one problem. If the mother has 5 children, and we say, oh, what about the children? Well, what about teaching the mother responsibility?
No, we can't do that. We have to have a no consequence, no fault society where you've got everybody making endless mistakes in their life and never having to suffer any consequences. And then you see that with Kaingaora. Nobody who's on that board is going to suffer any consequences that, had they done what they've done in a private company, they might well find themselves on the receiving end of the long arm of the law, because
they get a lawsuit for such poor behaviour.
Yeah, if they didn't get a lawsuit from shareholders, they might actually get the police coming knocking on their door because they've committed fraud or continued trading while insolvent.
They're delinquent directors.
All of these things. But because it's a government organisation, well, they just get sacked. Then they'll just sit there hoping that the government loses the next election, and then their pals will reappoint them to these positions. And meanwhile, the ministers and the finance minister who were supervising this, Grant Robertson, Megan Woods and Phil Twyford, were involved in all of this. These strategic geniuses who were the election strategy planners for the Labour Party, they were the ones who ran Kaingaora from the ministry as ministers. And what consequences do they get? Absolutely none. They're still sitting there in their cushy fat jobs. Grant Robertson's even got a job where he's paid more than the Prime Minister for the privilege of beggaring the nation. It staggers me that there is no financial consequences, and maybe, and I can't see Christopher Luxon doing this, but maybe we should learn something from that fellow in Argentina who's passed all sorts of laws saying that if you're going to print money at the Reserve Bank, well, you'll go to jail. Guess what? They're not printing money. Guess what? Inflation is halved in Argentina as a result. But of course, he's maligned in the media as the wrong kind of person and everything. But that's what we actually need to do. There needs to be real world consequences for politicians making stupid decisions.
Well, I think we need to sterilise people that are irresponsible so that they don't get to have multiple children. And I know it doesn't go with the correct narrative, but if people who can't figure out that I can't afford a house and I can't afford to house my family and I can't afford my children breed at 10 times the rate of people who are responsible, eventually there will be only people, like there'll be the 10 people that are responsible left trying to pay taxes to support the 10 million that are irresponsible.
Well, Margaret Thatcher famously said in the House of Commons, the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money.
To spend, exactly.
And then when you add that with Ronald Reagan's statement saying the 9 most dreaded words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you, you're kind of starting to get where we need to be. But we're a long way from that.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I think that Bill English was the right man for the job.
I agree.
With this information, there is reasons to act. If they act and do the right thing, then we can perhaps have some solutions. But at the end of the day, we need to, I think the locking up of land by councils and having these ever tighter cities with ever smaller plots is as big a problem, because if the average person has to work 10 years to save up a deposit for a house, that's a tough ask when in the day you could do it in 3 years. Yeah. And now to do it in 3 years, you've got to work a couple of jobs. It's still very doable. But again, people say, oh, well, I'd rather have an iPhone, I'd rather have a coffee every day. I remember when I was growing up, I used to have to cut my own lunch, a soft drink was an absolute treat. A beer was a treat when I became older because I was saving for a house. And guess what? I ended up buying a house or two.
Well, you've got a few.
Well, I had 46, but what? Who's counting?
Well, you're just an inspiration, really. You know that it can be done, and I know about your upbringing and how you were brought up, and you know, having to sleep under a coat, for example, and things like that. So I know you've done. I know you've done the hard yards, right? Yeah, the really hard yards. I know that. And that's why when I talk to you about these sorts of things, I listen very carefully because you've got experience in it and you know how these things work and you know how with a little bit of training that people can actually start to get ahead. But the problem is our education system doesn't do that training. Their parents don't know, so they can't do the training. And then we have this perpetual cycle of impoverishment that no government seems to know what to do to fix it.
Well, if you save 30% of your wages from the time you leave school till you're 28 and you don't get pregnant and then you meet and marry a wife, you'll be a multimillionaire with your investing. And it's that easy. But if you want to have children when you're 15, 16, 17, 18, and you want to have absent fathers because you haven't actually, you're not someone that can keep a man, or you're not a man that's worthy of being kept, then life's much harder for you and your children.
Exactly. All right, Paul, I better let you run along.
And the last thing I was going to say
yes,
is if tall women marry short men, they'll have taller sons, and the short men don't have to have the small man's disease. I just thought I'd let you know that as the last closing.
Well,
okay, mate.
It's a little gem, and we'll talk again next week. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, bye for now. Bye.
What has happened at Kaingaora would be criminal if it had happened in a private business. Those responsible need to be held to account. Tell us what you think about the goings-on in Kaingaora and what the buddies had to say by emailing inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057.
You're listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
Time for the mailbag. Some general feedback. I've got a comment here from Molly. She says, "Hi, Cam. Tool, Fear Inoculum. Check out the lyrics, the album, and the release date of the album. Seems Tool is very intuitive." Thanks, Molly. I'll check that. Some Facebook comments. Co says, "We the people surely missed you and RCR, Cam. A blessing to have you all back. Support our free media." And Suzanne says, "So funny listening to your show last night, Cam. I loved the whole show, especially that saying, for every rabbit above ground, there's 10 underground, referring to Legacy MSM calling RCR Rabbit Hole Radio." Robin says, "Looking forward to it." And Toby says, "Great to have you back, Cam." And it's great to be back. Now, about my interview with Simon Anderson, it's great to have RCR and Cam back on the airways. I thoroughly enjoyed Cam's interview with Simon Anderson. Simon's a hero in my eyes after his footage at Albert Park. And that comment was from Kirsty. Thanks, babe. Now, Molly also writes and says, "No, it's a distraction. They want us talking about it." That was in regard to talking about the politicians at the cafe. Did any other photographer, passerby, journalist see this? Are there any other reports on it? The whole thing is a ruse, including the shoplifting, I bet. It'll be a bait for misinformation, I bet you. And Peter from Hamilton says, "Hi, Cameron. Appreciated the discussion with Simon. Thank you for your efforts." Now, in my free-for-all discussion with Cam's buddies last week, we got a few comments. Rosa writes, "Welcome back. You've been missed. What's the number of homeschooling children in New Zealand since COVID mandates? I wouldn't send my kid to school today as the teachers can't teach, and it's all Marxist rubbish." Then I've got a anonymous comment, says to Cam and his buddy, as a teacher of 25 years in the education system and not returning to the education system after being mandated out, I can positively assure you that in my community, the masses of children that have not returned to school are being educated at home. After all, parents are the first teachers in a child's life. Our future is not safe in the hands of people educated at school. The tenacity and independent thinking in kids educated outside the system is a positive future in many ways. Schools are a factory process, manufacturing people to follow, not lead. I believe the world needs free, open-minded thinkers. Janet writes, very interesting to hear about Lindley's experience seeking help in optimizing her health. I've often thought our medical centres are more interested in keeping on, i.e. medicating, rather than helping us be the best we can without medication. Thanks, Lindley, for this heads up. An anonymous comment says, I didn't realise Cam's show was a comedy show, but I've had the best laughs this afternoon. Thanks, Cam and friends. My only complaint is that it's hard to get on with my school prep with all this hilarity going on. So grateful that you generous and smart people are back in my life. Thanks. Jen says, so pleased RCR is back. Congratulations to all. To Cam, I really enjoyed Cam's Buddies. It was filled with laugh out loud moments. Thank you for lifting my day. And Lindley is especially hilarious. So hilarious, it made me think Cam's Buddies would make a great road show, and then we could get to meet you all. Thank you, RCR team. I love listening to you all. Now, I've got a long one here from Liz, and it says, you are by far my favorite presenter. Oh, thanks, Liz. And I love everything you produce. Thank you. I was listening to your latest Cam's Buddies, and it occurred to me that I should speak to you about the brilliant and comprehensive health assessment program available in New Zealand that most people don't even know exists. I did cell well-being hair follicle health status reports for hundreds of people over a 3-year period with Health 2000 Hamilton, and then hundreds more for a Unichem pharmacy in Hamilton for another 3 years until mandates ended my job. I never had 2 reports come back from the lab in Germany that were even remotely similar. The technology has been available for almost 30 years, and many GPs or specialists around the world use it. But local medics are told it is total quackery. I had a doctor from Waikato Hospital come in incognito to get himself done, planning to prove it was quackery. However, he received quite a wake-up call when I explained the results on his 34-page report, and he left utterly convinced of its accuracy after confessing he actually was a doctor. I'll email you some of my own many reports done over the past 7 years so you can see how comprehensive and user-friendly it is. I would recommend you interview Aaron Wheeler, the New Zealand distributor, and he can tell people how to get their own reports done. 4 hair follicles get plucked with tweezers and immediately scanned, and a compressed file goes to Mega Lab in Hamburg, Germany. Results come back in 30 minutes. The body can reset itself in 90 days if you reduce what it is overloaded with and supply what it is deficient in. The report is in pieces, chart form with a page, each for vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, amino acids, 9 essential fatty acids, plus levels of heavy metals, chemicals, radiation, viruses, bacteria, fungal yeast, mold spores, and levels of electromagnetic frequencies from about 15 different sources. It also tells you which foods to avoid and which nutrients are specifically needed for cardiovascular health, gut health, and immune function. It only costs around $100 to $150, and you get a 30-minute consultation included in the price to guide you. I'm 68, still working full-time, fit as a fiddle with robust immune function. I regularly go cycling for 1 to 3 hours at a time and have the flexibility of someone half my age. One of the chief surgeons at the biggest hospital in Malaysia developed the gut health page of the report, and he trains anything from 150 to 700 doctors in countries around the world every month on how to use it with their patients. He certainly does so himself. His name is Dr. Radha Krishna. Aaron can tell you more. I hope this is helpful. Kind regards, Liz. P.S. I've worked in natural health in South Africa and New Zealand for about 40 years. Wow, that was fascinating. Better look into that one. So good to see the replays all up on the website again. Last night I listened in for the first time to one of Cam's buddy session. What a pleasure it was. Loved the buddies, their subject matter, and the easy chat. It made me feel like I was sitting with some mates, chewing the fat and having a few laughs. So good to have you all back in my days. Cheers, Jan. Rosa sends a note for Linley. iHerb sell 10,000 IU vitamin D3 plus K2, and it's not too many dollars. For the replay of the John Banks interview, Jan says, "Hi Cam, loved hearing Banksy, very well said. We have to come back as a nation. We've got to get back to basics and morals, or we'll be lost forever. Throw out all the woke stuff and leave our children alone. Love to hear you back, Cam. God bless, and let's fight for our nation." Anonymous comment says, loved the interview with John Banks. His thoughts on Israel hit the nail on the head. Also was encouraged about his faith being the foundation for society. Excellent, balanced and real thoughts. Thank you. Great show, Cam, and the Banksy interview was thumbs up. Get it right, Cam. Those of us who have lived in the Middle East like you support innocent Palestinians who are being killed, bombed, left bereft and disabled and worse. You're doing exactly what you claim the Greens are doing, twisting facts. To support Palestine does not mean one supports Hamas. It means we do not support the killing of people, whoever they are. To take another person's life is the greatest theft. You should also realize Hamas was formed as a resistance to Israel's treatment of Palestinians. I am Christian. I have Jewish relatives. I come from Lebanon. That's nice. You're entitled to your opinion, and I'm entitled to mine. Dear Cam, I just heard your post-Easter John Banks interview replay broadcast on Saturday, the 11th of May. Nice discussion. Mr. Banks doesn't pull punches, does he? The remarks about the civil service are spot on, but remember there was also the Prime Minister's and Cabinet Office who thought they were acting above protocol and, in my opinion, were a terrorist group in disguise. I can't think of any other words to describe what they've done except traitors. I believe RCR need to start investigations and create articles and interviews about each head of a civil service branch that needs exposing so that us, the people, can know exactly who were responsible. I was disgusted but understood when Ardern got her New Zealand accolades, as did Bloomfield. Maybe standing in a box in front of a judicial inquiry might be a final justice for them. We should not wait with bated breath. Methinks global circumstances may see the bad guys win when digital ID and the WHO health protocols that New Zealand look to be signing up to will overcome us all. I hope not, but the tsunami is coming. I like the promoted idea of Seymour and Winston stepping up to begin the culling of the deadwood. Will it take Luxon to be on board? Remember, he is the head of the intelligence and security portfolios, and I believe he and Collins also act for the globalists. With respect, Rob. And now we've got some comments about my interview with Rachel Stewart from last week. Beth writes and says, Rachel Stewart is a real gem and I love her frankness. She speaks so much sense. Thanks for getting her on, Cam. An anonymous comment says, Cam, I went into the toilets at Commercial Bay in central Auckland last week. As you walk into the ladies' toilets, you have to look straight into the men's toilets where the men are piddling before you can go into the ladies' toilets. It's disgusting, and it's not something that I want to see when I go to a public toilet. And my mate Mike from Foxton writes and says, Hi, Cam, so glad you have back on board and bringing such amazing people to give us the truth and tell it as it is. I actually met Rachel Stewart on Saturday at the Inflection Point presentation, and man, is she awesome. As you said, as subtle as a brick in the face, but what a breath of fresh air. I picked up on one bit of information she shared that I believe was wrong. She said, blokes don't listen to women. I listened to my wife, and she was a woman, a real woman, with woman parts and able to have babies. And guess what? She was right. I may have been right once, but that is still a debate in my head, and I can now claim that it was a win but usually she was right. The whole inflection point was a huge success, and it was only the people that didn't go that missed out. I learned so much and again met so many great people. Being amongst like-minded people is always uplifting and does stiffen the spine. Rachel said that the interview with her was the best she had ever done and was a pleasure. And as I said to Paul, she is a really great person and properly down to earth, just the type of people we need to get the truth out. Brilliant interview, Mike from Foxton. A couple of comments from Facebook about that interview as well. Elizabeth says, really enjoyed listening to Rachel's take on things. So glad that RCR has forged such a strong relationship with her and invite her on regularly. Her perspective is especially important for folk to hear. And Alex replies, Elizabeth, yes, I agree. She is a great speaker and not afraid to speak up, and especially since she has a unique perspective. And then regarding my interview with Shane Jones, discussing the focus of his recent speeches in Parliament, Jane writes and says, if there was only more serving politicians with the same testicular fortitude as Shane Jones, his speeches in the House are just brilliant. Great show, Cam. It's quickly become a favourite of mine. Rob says Shane Jones is doing a hell of a job. Thanks, Cam Slater, for YouTube. And Jan writes and says, hi, Cam. We've finally got some people in Parliament with balls. Even on Mike Hosking's show, Shane is applauded for speaking his mind and saying what a lot of people are too afraid to admit. And he's perfectly right with his statement. If any of these activist judges want to amend legislation, they should run for office and campaign on those issues. We need massive reforms to get this country back on track, not least of all by telling the Waitangi Tribunal their time is up. I had a comment about Simon O'Connor on China's spying. Julianne should have taken her rowboat to the Chathams. And then my discussion with the buddies on charter schools, Delwyn writes, hi, Cam, welcome back. Along with a number of your guests, I'm delighted to hear that charter schools are also coming back. I'm also aware of a number of excellent teachers who are creatively doing other things after being mandated out of their jobs. I have it on good authority that a music examiner was once known to add to the adage you mentioned this week, and those who can't teach, examine. Keep up the great work. It was a very interesting show with Rachel and Simon on too. Tony writes with a headline, Quick Learners for Cam the Cruncher. I, Cam, listened to your Cam's buddies and remembered back to my school days when my third form teacher was so disgusted with our spelling performance that he said tomorrow he'd give the strap for every mistake in the test the next day. The class was big at 54 by today's standards, and we chatted amongst ourselves saying the teacher would be worn out even strapping half the class. So we did no extra learning. The next morning, after the test papers were handed in, 4 other teachers arrived with their wicked-looking straps and did the whole class over, resulting in some very quick learning. I thank them for waking us up to face the real world. Yes, I did those 2 weeks of military training at school, very good for learning, a bit of discipline from tough army blokes who let us shoot 5 rounds from the Bren and 20 rounds from a Browning at a rifle range. Schools need properly trained teachers today, not these computerized namby-pamby muppets that think they're teachers. So that's my 10 cents of opinion. And that's Tony, a 94-year-old young student who is still learning. And that's the mailbag for this week. That's it for the Crunch this week. Sandra Goudie was a straight shooter, as usual, and you're never left wondering what she thinks about anything. And boy, is she annoyed with the Waitangi Tribunal. And as usual, Michael Bassett showed us his incredible depth of knowledge in New Zealand politics. He certainly isn't a fan of the last government and is very concerned that politicians seem to be shying away from dealing with the hard issues. One thing is for sure, though, both Sandra and Michael are concerned where this revisionist history is heading us towards. Unless and until politicians actually make some meaningful legislative changes, then we're in for even more disruption. These sorts of discussions show why it is that Reality Check Radio exists, so we can share these interesting characters with you all and have difficult discussions and not shy away from them. You can keep up with all my shows and indeed all of our shows on RCR by using the RCR app. And you can even use the app to stream live. And a big thanks to the team that put together the show, helped make it all work. It's been a real pleasure having you all back again this week. And I'm loving your feedback and really enjoying talking to so many people sharing their thoughts on politics, life, and everything in between. So a big shout out to you all and thank you for listening and having faith in me as we continue to explore what I call the beautiful game of politics. Don't forget, email suggestions to inbox@Reality Check Radio for people for me to interview. And let's make this show the best political show in New Zealand. Stay tuned for a repeat of Rodney Hyde's Real Talk coming up next, followed by a replay of Truth Speaker with Tobias Tahi. And finally, a song to finish that was suggested by my biggest fan on Waiheke, Anchor Me by the Muttonbirds. I look forward to having you join me again next week for The Crunch with Cam Slater.
You've been listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater. Remember, you can check out the replays for today's show on our website at www.realitycheck.radio/replays. Tune in every Thursday at 4 p.m. for more with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.